Hello, I'm Michael Henderson, and welcome to my presentation about navigating the site development process. I'm going to give an overview and then look at some ways we may be able to speed up the process. So first, what is the site development process? Well, I'm going to define it as the process starting from a concept plan and finishing with a fully certified site, ready to build a building or whatever your facility may be. Also, this doesn't include the building. This is all the site, the utilities, the parking lot, the sidewalks, stormwater management, infrastructure, things of those nature. So starting with a concept plan of what we want to build and where we want to build it, we'll start with our due diligence. That's where we'll go and do the research of the rules and regulations that will determine our design of our site. It won't take too long until we start reaching out to the public. We'll start holding meetings with the commissioners and the public stakeholders for their input. And this process usually ends with some type of rezoning hearing where the developer essentially gains permission to build a facility. Now, during this entire time, we're doing our site development plans. So it isn't long after the public outreach session ends that we get our first initial submittal into the regulatory review agencies. And this is where I want to spend most of the time. Even though it doesn't look like much, even though it looks like right after we get our regulatory review, we do a few revisions to those, then we get our land disturbance permit and begin construction. And that's basically it. We certify it, and our job as a site designer is done. But what you'll find is that isn't quite really how it works if you've ever been involved with the site development process. It looks something like this. Well, what's going on here? Well, for one thing, there are a lot of reviewers. So when you do one revision to your plans, it may affect something that has to go through all of the other reviewers, or maybe just a few reviewers. But what you find is you end up in this cycle that repeats over and over of reviewing and revision and reviewing and revision. And you can't get out of this cycle until every single checkbox on every single checklist from every single review agency is satisfied. And only at that point do they release your land disturbance permit. So that kind of tends to lead to the question of why can't we just do it right the first time? Why can't we just get our plans so good that every single checkbox is satisfied on the very first review? To answer that seemingly simple question, I'd like to put ourselves in the shoes of the reviewer. In this case, the erosion control reviewer for a project I did 2 years ago called Pine Mountain Park that is currently under construction. So here's the erosion control checklist that was used for this project. There are 53 items. Let's just jump into number 1, which is pretty simple. The applicable erosion, sedimentation, and pollution control plan checklist established by the Commission as of January 1 of the year in which the land disturbing activity was permitted must accompany the plans. Simple enough. Put the erosion control plan checklist on your plans. So you can see here on page C101, it's prominent over on the left. Not all of the items are this simple though. Probably the most important is number 50, which reads, provide a minimum of 67 cubic yards of sediment storage per acre drained using a temporary sediment basin, retrofitted detention pond, and or excavated inlet sediment traps for each common discharge location. In other words, provide sediment storage at each discharge point so your sedimentation that you create during construction doesn't enter the downstream waterways. And if you were an erosion control reviewer, you would see the southern part of the property here on page C111, and the thing that would jump right out at you is the 2 sediment basins that are shown here in yellow and the calculations that are highlighted in green. But you'd also notice that this is just the southern part of the property, and you need to continue on to the next page and see that there is one more sediment basin and accompanying calculations. Moving on past that, to the northern part of the property, there are 3 more basins and 3 more set of calculations. So that takes care of the first phase of erosion control, sedimentation, storage. But when we go from that initial phase to that secondary phase where we start doing all our mass grading, we often have a change in the location or structure of the sediment pond. And in this case, when we move over to phase 2, we see that one of the basins is moved because one of the state waters has actually been filled in through a 404 permit. And we have 2 more down in the south side that are being installed at the new discharge locations. And of course, the calculations that go by that. So I hope you can see that even though it was just one checklist item, it's not nearly as straightforward as just finding one data point and taking that and saying, yes, that's approved or that's not approved. It's more like looking through a sea of data points for just the ones that you need to evaluate. In fact, with 69 pages in this set, it's more like looking through 69 seas of data points for your data set. And that's kind of the point I want to make. Bring this down a level of abstraction and see everything on this page as just data points. The silt fence, the grades, every piece of information can just be seen as just a data point. So what the reviewer wants to look at is just a data set. He or she has a set of data that he's going to either say is approved or not approved, depending on his judgment of that piece of information. So when we break this down, what we would see would be something like this, where the pieces of data have been searched through and the ones that have needed to be evaluated have been found by the reviewer and then evaluated. And at this point, everything would be sent back to the designer, usually with just this information. So a really low bandwidth piece of information. Did you get it right? Did you get it wrong? Could I not find it? Maybe some small piece of written information to the designer from the reviewer. And this wouldn't be right away. The reviewer will submit his to a planning department or some kind of central location typically, who will distribute the plans and the comments between the reviewer and the designer. So what you end up with is a high latency where you can't find out about any information or any comments until everybody is finished working on their comments, which is unfortunate. So what we want to do is we want to try to ultimately decrease these review times. And now that we've kind of discussed how the review actually happens typically, we can start to see that if we can decrease those data points that are filtered by the reviewer, we can reduce those search times. So how can we reduce those number of data points? Well, we can just annotate the checklist. That narrows the area that the reviewer needs to look through to find their data set. Even better, if there's something like the detention basins that we saw in our example, where there were 8 of them for one line item, we can explain that on the checklist or make a note of it. And in that same vein, it's a good idea to email pertinent information to the reviewer when you submit your plans, at least a methodology, and point out anything that may not be standard or may give the reviewer difficulty in understanding. Now the third one, decrease latency between designer and reviewer. That's not quite so straightforward in my mind. I used to bring donuts to plan review, which would give kind of a personal feel to it and usually get a better response time for the reviewer. Now that most plan submittals are online and electronic, it takes a little more to build that relationship with the reviewer, but I always think it's definitely worth making that effort. But in any event, all of these things are basically geared towards reducing the effort for the reviewer. And we expect that to turn around and equate to a reduced review time for us. But if we look at all these examples, excluding the donuts, we'll notice that they all take active involvement from the reviewer. And what I mean by that is the reviewer has to still go through and read the directions on the annotated checklist or the email and translate that written word into directions and find it. It's an active process for the reviewer. So even though we may be decreasing their overall effort, we are still giving them another task, and we need to be cognizant of it. What I think would be even better is if we could make the whole review experience a lot more passive for the reviewer. And I've kind of made up just this little presentation within a presentation just to kind of show what I think an ideal situation, if I was the reviewer, would be for me. And here it is. Welcome to the Pine Mountain Park Regulatory Review Experience. At any time, press the pause button to bring up tools on the right, where you can comment, draw, highlight, measure, take notes, or contact the designer. All available review information can be accessed from the menu on the left. Please select your regulatory review interest when you are ready. Erosion Control Review. On the screen is the Erosion, Sedimentation, and Pollution Control Plan Checklist for Common Development Construction Projects. There are 4 pages. Please select the page and then the light item on the page you wish to view. Number 50. Due to the site being within 1 mile of an impaired stream segment, the sediment storage has increased to 134 cubic yards per acre. During Phase 1, this will be achieved by installing 6 sediment traps. During Phase 2, Sediment Trap 2 will move. 1 temporary sediment pond will be added, and 1 excavated inlet trap will be installed to accommodate the new drainage patterns. At all times, sediment traps will provide in excess of 134 cubic yards per acre of storage. Approximately 4.7 acres drain to sediment trap 1. This sediment trap is an irregular shape with a length to width ratio exceeding 2 to 1, is 4 feet deep, and has side slopes of 2 to 1. The total storage volume is 2,963 cubic yards. Approximately 4 acres drains to sediment trap 2. The sediment trap is 50 feet by 100 feet, 4 feet deep with 2 to 1 side slopes. Approximately 4 acres drain to sediment trap 3. The sediment trap is an irregular shape with a length to width ratio exceeding 2 to 1, is 4 feet deep, has 2 to 1 side slopes. The total storage volume is 2,389 cubic yards. Approximately 0.5 acres drain to sediment trap 4. The sediment trap is an irregular shape with a length to width ratio exceeding 2 to 1, is 4 feet deep, has 2 to 1 side slopes. The storage volume is 363 cubic yards. Approximately 3.3 acres drain to sediment trap 5. The sediment trap is an irregular shape with a length to width ratio exceeding 2 to 1, is 4 feet deep, has side slopes of 2 to 1, and the total storage volume is 1,481 cubic yards. Approximately 4.6 acres drain to sediment trap 6. The sediment trap is an irregular shape with a length to width ratio exceeding 2 to 1, is 4 feet deep, has 2 to 1 side slopes. The total storage volume is 4,920 cubic yards. During Phase 2, Sediment Trap 2 will move to a new location. This will accommodate the new drainage pattern. A temporary sediment pond will also be installed to drain approximately 9 acres. The sediment pond is an irregular shape with a length to width ratio exceeding 2 to 1, is 10 feet deep and has 3-to-1 side slopes. The total storage volume is 1,392 cubic yards. In addition, an excavated inlet trap will be installed to drain approximately 3/4 of an acre. The sediment trap is an irregular shape with a length-to-weight ratio exceeding 2-to-1, is 18 inches deep, and has 2-to-1 side slopes. The total storage volume is 219 cubic yards. This concludes item 50. Press back to return to the main menu. So this is my ideal version of an erosion control review in my mind. But can this magically take us back to our ideal schedule here that we have, where construction is known and regulatory review is a relatively small and non-time consuming part of the project? I think so. It's not going to be immediately. One of the problems we haven't discussed is that we're just one of the designers. We're in a queue, so it's the first in, first out. But we're definitely going to get some preferential treatment for producing something of this caliber. But I'm sure one of the first questions everybody's going to ask is how about the design labor? This is going to be a big burden for the designer. It took me an embarrassing amount of hours to produce that little production that you just saw, which only counted for one item on one checklist from one review agency, if you recall. But also recall that if you look up in the top left here, the site design starts from the beginning of the project. As soon as we have a concept, we can start doing this. And when we do it in-house like this, when we take this job away from the reviewer and put it upon ourselves, we can begin to optimize this process to where it doesn't take the ridiculous amount of hours to just do one item on one checklist. So I hope today I've convinced you that maybe we can help ourselves a little bit by helping the reviewers a lot. And by doing that, maybe we can make our site development process more known and a little faster. So with that, let's go through the overview. Our goal is to reduce the overall regulatory review times. As designers, we're going to help the reviewers by pre-filtering the data to the reviewers where possible. We're going to increase our upfront explanation of methodology to increase the bandwidth with the reviewer. We're going to build a relationship with the reviewer by being conscientious of what and how information is presented. We're going to make the process of finding information as passive as possible for the reviewers. And finally, we're going to begin to optimize the process of presenting the data in-house. And that concludes my presentation on the site development process. Thank you very much.